Welcome back to another episode of Spicy Brain Podcast. On today's episode, we have the wonderful Kyra Hall-Gelly, who's the CEO and founder of Neuro Tribe. Neuro Tribe is a therapy clinic that specializes in supporting neurodivergent people, which, believe it or not, is actually quite rare. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing all things around what does neurodivergent-affirming therapy look like, what is fundamentally flawed in traditional therapy, and what type of support can neurodivergent people expect when they visit clinics like Neuro Tribe or any other organizations to support neurodivergent people. Kyra, welcome to the Spicy Brain Podcast.
Hello, thank you.
I don't even think you realize how excited I am to have you here and to have this conversation because, you know, we speak about Neuro Tribe and specializing therapy for neurodivergent people. Myself, I'm still figuring therapy out, as per se. And as many autistic people, we've all had our journeys with therapy, and mine, unfortunately, probably hasn't been the best.
Yeah.
Not because of stigma whatsoever. We're obviously on a podcast talking about autism and mental health and all these things. So stigma has never been the issue for me. I think it's more how challenging I found therapy because it's very generic. It's very homework driven and these big concepts that then I really struggled in putting into practice as per se. And then a big thing for me with therapy was I was always masking throughout that process, through those, you know, every single meeting that I was having. So just as a matter of like level setting, I'm approaching today with complete curiosity. I want to learn from you. I want to learn about the type of therapy that you guys provide at Neuro Tribe. And I'm sure that so many of the listeners are as well, because I don't think therapy is spoken about enough for neurodivergent people, and people don't really know the options that are out there. So why don't we start with you, your journey, and what led you on to starting Neuro Tribe?
Okay, so I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking that when I look back there, it's it's a time in my life when we set up Neuro Tribe that was really full of a lot of chronic stress and some quite traumatic things. So it's sometimes difficult to pull together a coherent narrative about it. But so I can pull together like some of the main strands. So it's founded by me and my mum.
Oh,
so my mum, Jan Hall, and myself. Yeah, and
the magic duo.
Yeah. Not sure about magic, but we're definitely a duo. But yeah, so we both trained to be arts therapists at the same place. And our family is very neurodivergent in itself. We've got a lot of different neurodiversities within our family. And I think back then when my son was young, we didn't really know much about that. We didn't really have words for it, or maybe understand the ways in which we were struggling and why, and the impact that was having on us, the combination of different neurodiversities and how that was playing out. And also there was a lot to do with our family is a very, we're all people of colour and mixed race people as well. So there was some crossover there, which meant that we just couldn't find the kind of support that we needed. And I'm thinking of an example. I remember when my son was at his primary school and he was really struggling, not just with the learning, but with the social isolation and these different things. And I didn't know what autism was, of course, back then. And I was talking to his teachers because he was fine at home, and then he would go out into the school system and he would come back really, really distressed, and his mental health was really suffering. And I'm like, there's something going on here. And I'm talking to the teachers and they're none the wiser, or they're not really taking the information that I'm saying. And I didn't have the language to talk about it in. They wouldn't sanction any kind of educational psychology for him, or get him a diagnosis or support of any type.
Yeah, and I feel like as well back then, I relate to that because school was pretty difficult for me, but I'm not sure if you had this experience that in those conversations, just because he would have been presenting with challenges, then he's singled out as like he's the problem, versus him having a difference that can be supported and then accommodated within the school system.
Yeah. I mean, what we had was he's a puzzle, which...
That's a loaded bomb.
It is.
Where do we unpiece that puzzle, shall we say? Where do we go with from there?
Yeah, he's a puzzle.
That's a lot.
And, you know, for his mental health, he was assigned a counsellor at the school. Mm-hmm. But this counsellor was not particularly neurodivergent-affirming. And I guess this was much more common back in the day, but a lot of the issues he was having the blame was placed on us as parents and on attachment issues. And there used to be this whole thing around school refusal, you know, not the fact that he's finding it really difficult and challenging to go to school because of the system, but he's just refusing to go to school. So it was quite shaming. And there was then there was some racialized elements that came into that. Yeah. I don't think they were conscious, you know, the people weren't meaning to do it, but that intersection of those things. And we just got to the point where that's just one example of what was going on for our family. And we were like, we need to find some support that works for us. And we just couldn't find it. So we set it up, basically.
How did you go from the place of not really having the language for it, not knowing what his differences was, to then saying, we're setting something up for neurodivergent people? So, like, how did that bridge happen?
How did that happen to me? When I look back to that time, I guess like many parents, I started to ask questions, maybe on the internet, like, why is this happening for my child? Why is X happening? You know, and some quite, the language started to come about, but it was all deficit language. It was all Asperger's syndrome and autism spectrum disorder and all of these things, and, you know, special needs, which I have an issue with that because I'm like, wanting to belong and be in an environment that, you know, is inclusive for you is not a special need. It's just a human need. So, and I think that's how I started to acquire that language. And then one thing which I always advise parents to do is I eventually came upon a group of parents, like a steering group, parent carer forums, and they were really massively helpful because it's a group of supportive parents who are also on the same journey as you, and you're all learning together, and you have to become an expert.
100%. And I think no one really understands what it's like unless you're going through the same. And you're blocked at every door you try to open to find answers for your kids or yourselves. And therefore, like, it's very lonely. And something I speak about a lot is the fact that our disability, you know, or being neurodivergent as a person, it's invisible. So how do you build that connection with other people that might be going through the same? It's very difficult, right? And to have those communities is everything, and it's the lifeline for many parents, because instantly you feel less alone. You find that representation, and you're shedding off that shame that was put on you as well, right? Because that is so unfair, but there's other people that relate to your story.
Yeah, I mean, you've just reminded me of how isolating actually it was, because, I mean, I forget now I'm in an organisation surrounded by gorgeous neurodivergent people. There's not that conflict for me the same as there was when I was out in the neurotypical working world, for example. There's not that isolation. But you've just reminded me back then of how isolating that was, and the isolation that a lot of our clients are coming with, you know, and how heartbreaking it is also to witness your child going through that isolation.
Yeah, because they don't, you obviously don't have the words for it. They don't either, right? So it's very difficult. And I think something that, you know, there's a lot of conversations now about late diagnosed women, etc. But something that also should be spoken about is diagnosis in people that aren't white, full stop. So you mentioned that your family is of mixed race background. Black and brown families really struggle as well to get through to that diagnosis, much more than what your average white family would. So I'm sure that's an added layer that you were trying to navigate early on, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't have words for that either, I don't think, at the time. So, that's why it's become quite a crucial part of Neuro Tribe's work, is to look at an anti-oppressive approach as a whole, not just in terms of neuro-inclusion, but in terms of racialized identities as well, because my experience was, and there's a lot of different experiences that people have had around this, but our experience was that our son's intelligence was downgraded and the expectations were downgraded because of the colour of his mother's skin, essentially. And that meant that certain ways he was struggling academically were not picked up. They were just put down to, oh, well, he's obviously just not very bright then. When actually, you've got an extremely bright child who is challenged in certain ways because of a dyslexia profile and an autism profile and how that shows up for him and the teaching methods that are being used, and that's being missed because of people's underlying biases around race.
Their lack of understanding and leading with that bias then leads to him potentially, or any kid, getting support early to then be able to thrive and shine in the areas that he is great at, right? That the system doesn't really support or highlight. So I think it's very important to approach it from that angle as well. Okay, so that's how you and your mom started to some extent. You went and you got qualified as therapist. And what did early days Neuro Tribe look like?
So early days Neuro Tribe looked like us firstly running a workshop, like a creative workshop for children and young people who were neurodivergent. And that's how we were looking to tackle the social isolation. And we also ran kind of workshops where we brought all of these books that had quite a positive forward-thinking perspective on neurodiversity to groups of school mums and parent carers that that were kind of they didn't have the language to talk about things either. That's how we started. And we were also doing therapy.
Okay.
And we wanted to be a wraparound service, but there's only the two of us at this point. So we couldn't manage that all. And before we knew it, our books got really full. So we had a full client load each.
Amazing.
And we were loving it. We were loving this, but we were like, there's so much need out there. We're going to have to take on some more therapists. So when we advertised, to our surprise, we had so many beautiful neurodivergent, talented therapists turn up and go, this is amazing. We love the values you're coming with, the way that you're expressing those values on your website. You've taken so much time to try and be neuro-inclusive. We'd really like to know more about your organisation and work with you. So then we grew to a team of 6.
Wow.
And then it carried on, and now we're a team of 18, I think.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's really, really impressive. And I think I find it particularly impressive because, as I mentioned, I got diagnosed 3 years ago. And even, how long ago was Neuro Tribe founded?
So we founded in 2018.
2018.
Yeah.
Okay. So to say I got diagnosed 3 years ago, so 2022 and say 2023, I didn't really know of any services like that. I found it extremely lonely when I got diagnosed because you get given this diagnosis and off you go. And no one's really telling you what therapy to access, what can be accommodating for you and all these different things. And I think, that lack of knowledge is representative to a lot of neurodivergent people. I think you're obviously in that world of therapy that is catered for neurodivergent people. But I know for a fact, not enough people know about those services, because myself, I would have access to that as soon as. It's just not really, not that it's not promoted, it's just maybe the therapists themselves don't know that there's a particular service like that where you'll instantly feel understood and represented. And I think it goes the same way. The world is built for neurotypical people. That means that traditional therapy systems are also built for neurotypical people.
Yes.
And I've experienced that myself. So a little bit of context about my exposure to therapy, shall we say. And I did say I'm approaching it from a curious standpoint because I accessed therapy 6 months prior to getting diagnosed.
Okay.
And as many late diagnosed autistic women, I reached an autism diagnosis on the back of poor mental health, which was led from burnout to masking all these different things, right? And I started therapy with a diagnosis of severe anxiety and mild to severe depression. And I entered CBT therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And time went on, and I just didn't see the improvements. No fault to the therapist, I always say that, but it didn't work for me. I found it extremely homework heavy when I was already struggling to get up in the morning and show up to work and do these basic needs, that I just found it very difficult. And I did realize as time went on, my therapist getting more heavily frustrated, shall we say, with my lack of progress.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's when, for me, and as neurodivergent people, we're very in touch of like body language and the signs that you get off people that aren't really spoken words. And I was just, maybe she wasn't, but that's how I was feeling. And that was my sign to take a step back. Okay. I was like, I've been doing this for 6 months. It's not really working. I think that there's something fundamentally different with me that isn't really depression or anxiety, which yes, but it's a byproduct, I've always said. So that was me. Then I pursued the diagnosis. I got the diagnosis. And straight after the diagnosis, I actually did a few sessions with the lady who diagnosed me, who I adore. And I've spoken about her on the podcast, and she's amazing. And that was the first time I experienced some form of positive therapy, because there wasn't any forms or labels attached, such as CBT, which works for many, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be used so widely, but it didn't for me.
Yeah.
And she was using very practical, I don't know what it is, I'm sure you have some language, but it was very practical kind of tips and tricks on how to manage my executive functioning and areas of my day that I was deeply challenged with. Like, I didn't want to go to therapy to revisit trauma. Like, I don't care about that. I don't really have trauma. My issue was like, I can't function on a day-to-day basis because of how my brain is setting me up to fail in this world. So I found that really useful. And then after I did a few sessions with her, and after a bout of extreme burnout at work, I accessed therapy again and did ACT.
Yep. Acceptance, commitment.
That.
Therapy. Yeah.
That's what Kyra said.
Yeah.
That's why we have an expert on today. So I found that excellent, and I found it insightful. However, I really struggled turning such a big concept in theory into practice on a random Tuesday when I was struggling to figure things out. And I'm like, okay, I remember that thing I worked on in therapy, but how do I make that work today? And I couldn't build that connection. So as you can see, I've had a bit of a, different journey with therapy. And that leads me on to the fact that it's actually reported that autistic people, 70 to 80% of autistic people have poor mental health or struggle with mental health. But I feel like traditional therapy isn't built for us. So what is it that we struggle so much in therapy as neurodivergent people, do you think?
Well, I think that partly we need to uncouple this idea that poor mental health, naturally comes with neurodivergence, because it doesn't. So I think it is the tension of where a neurodivergence meets a neurotypical system, and there is relational trauma a lot of the time in that, and it's quite complex relational trauma, and it's quite new for therapy to think in a way that isn't just attached to your primary caregivers and your family. So thinking about relational trauma happening within the context of school, for example, thinking about how bullying, which is a very common experience for neurodivergent children and adults, in work settings, etc., and how repeatedly that can be relational trauma. It's a valid traumatic repetition. I think that's really important for therapists to acknowledge the size and the impact of that. A lot of therapies wouldn't necessarily do that for a start. And I also think that a lot of the methods, what our clients tell us is a lot of the methods that are used in traditional therapies are just not working for neurodivergent people. And like what we find is quite intuitively, because our team is a majority neurodivergent team and has their lived experience and professional experience, they have also found those things in the course of their own therapy, in the course of their own training. And so they're able to sometimes collaborate with the client and adapt the methods to be more useful to the client. And we're still really working this out because it's quite new in terms of therapeutic approach, and the same thing is being done in terms of race as well, because the same thing is happening where you've got kind of Western-centric biases that underpin the therapeutic concepts. There's also a huge conflict there. I'm feeling like I'm getting really technical.
No, please educate us. No, it's fascinating because I do agree with you. One of the challenges that I faced was the fact that I, as an autistic woman, struggled to communicate my emotions. And I would only do that with someone that's my safe space. And that obviously, the nature of therapy is inherently difficult to create a safe space if that person hasn't opened up and told them about themselves and all these things, which I understand that's like a barrier which professionally you can cross. It's not within the therapist's interest to share that. However, if Lara as a patient knows that my therapist has experience with being neurodivergent or someone in their family, just that knowledge makes me feel safe because you're coming from a place of understanding versus just trying to put me through a generic process that millions of people have been through, but that it hasn't been adapted to me and my challenges, which are not generic. So I think that's the key part of like being able to relate to some of the experiences that patients are going through is what makes that therapy also adaptive, right?
I mean, that is why we consciously created a team of people with the lived experience, because it is massively important. And to create psychological safety, you'll notice that our therapists do disclose a certain amount. I mean, the way that we put ourselves forward as an organisation hopefully signals strongly to people that we are a majority neurodivergent team. So even our allies, and they really are allies on our team who may not be neurodivergent, may also be parent carers, or they have worked with the neurodivergent community for a very long time, and they learn with us because we're all supervised in-house as well, so which is quite different for a therapy organisation. So we're learning between ourselves and from our neurodivergent colleagues. And we all have there's so many different ways that our neurodiversity show up that actually I think what that brings is we're able to just meet our clients as the individual that they are, as opposed to them being lost under a blanket kind of I'm neurodivergent banner thing, which I think can happen sometimes.
And it's so wide. Like being neurodivergent is just such a broad term. Like if we just use autism as per se, it presents differently for every single individual. The typical cliche of like you've only met one autistic person if you met an autistic person, right? And I think that also is challenging for, I'm sure, therapists themselves to be able to adapt because how it shows up for me, it might be different to someone else, but there are generic terms that we would struggle with that you can make it accommodating.
See, it's interesting because as you're asking me these questions, I'm thinking that I'm probably almost not the best person to answer them simply because for us it isn't a struggle. I mean, because we're in a majority neurodivergent team and we're coming from that perspective, what I find is I find it amazing that it's a struggle somewhere for therapists, because I'm like, but that's obvious. Like, why? Of course, if you if you share this, then that's gonna be like, oh, I can feel comfortable in this space. I don't have to explain to you certain things. It's going to create a level of psychological safety. So when you say that, I'm like, oh, is it? Do people find that difficult?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I think that's the term you hear therapy isn't for me comes from, I think, a place of struggle, of challenge, challenge of trying to access services. And I think I can speak for a lot of people that the challenge as well with therapy, in my opinion, is that you reach for therapy when you're at need. You really need it. And to then, in that space of needing, to need to find the right therapist or someone that understands your neurodiversity is an added layer that then just pushes you away from it, right? So I think it actually fills me with joy, the fact that you find it interesting that people find it challenging. Because I'm like, I want to explore the services. Because what a world would it be in which it's normalized, the fact that you accommodate neurodivergent people and you accommodate the needs to support them with therapy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Or is it, do we accommodate, or are we just, I think that's the struggle I have. And I also think of my own experience when I think, okay, out there in the world of work, in neurotypical world of work, for example, I remember it feeling really difficult, there being a lot of friction. I'm not good with boredom or repetitive tasks or following rules or, things like that. So it was quite difficult. I left jobs and just walked out of them like, I'm done. Not doing this, over and over again. Yeah. So my work history is really patterned. But setting up Neuro Tribe and working within that, I don't find that a struggle. So I guess I look at therapy the same way, because I'm like, maybe we don't, that's the bit that we don't see. Is that the struggle that other therapists have in meeting neurodivergent clients where they're at.
Yeah, and I think it's testament as to if we surround ourselves with people that are wired the same way that we are, we don't feel that friction and we don't feel that struggle, right? And I think the challenges that neurodivergent people face when engaging with the world and society and the workplace and then needing to access therapy is because, once again, it's built to, as Luke Bearden would say, the predominant neurotype, which in our case in the world is neurotypical people that aren't wired like us. But if you create that safe bubble and community and space that early on neurotribes was, you aren't exposed to those challenges and friction, which I think is beautiful within itself. And how about the concept of masking in therapy? Because that's something I really experienced as a patient. Obviously, therapy, I've found challenging, and just showing up and needing to speak about myself. Like, do you and the team of therapists, do they identify when someone's masking? Do they support a person in just coming as they are and not needing to kind of cater some of their traits of autism?
I mean, I can't speak for all the therapists on the team. I think we all have our nuanced perspectives on that. But I think we don't ask or expect our clients to unmask, because we mask because it's a survival mechanism. You don't know us, you don't know who we are. It's okay to feel like you don't want to unmask in therapy for as long as you like. It's our job to establish a relationship of trust with you, and then perhaps you will feel comfortable to not do that, and that's absolutely fine. We can. I don't know whether there's a bit of a thing in therapy. You maybe be able to enlighten me on this, but I wonder if there's a bit of a thing where it's expected that clients need to come and unmask in therapy, and if somehow that means that the therapy is more successful or something. That's not how I've experienced therapy myself.
Yeah, I do feel that potentially your traditional therapists aren't really exposed to people being neurodivergent, and that's not something that's exposed early on in the conversations. The same way you're asking me, what does my sleep look like? Or am I losing appetite because of my depression? How about we explore that as the questionnaire? There's nothing of a different wiring in the brain and a difference in the brain. And I think by those questions not being included in that early day exploration of that relationship, it's then ignored or neglected, and then the therapist doesn't really acknowledge it throughout. So if you're going through a process that isn't catered for the type of brain that you have, you automatically, and without wanting to, put a mask up to survive, as you said. So I think that's maybe where it comes from, and maybe it's a conversation to have as to like, how do we shake the roots of traditional therapy to embed those conversations early on? And if I wouldn't, for example, when I went through that questionnaire, right, to access therapy, if there would have been questions about being neurodivergent, autism, ADHD, that would have triggered a question in my mind as to like, I've never been asked. I've never explored this. Let me go and educate myself. What does this mean? Because the process that I followed was like, as I mentioned, 6 months through therapy. Then I realized, okay, I think I'm different. I don't really know what it is. One day I Googled autism and I was like, tick, 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 tick. I hit 10 out of 10 here, but I was going through therapy for months and that at no stage that ever came up, those differences, right? So I think that's the solution that I would see, if there is one solution, to maybe early on embed that, to then have those conversations, because I'm sure a lot of therapists are treating patients and they're not really seeing the progress. Like my therapist wasn't seeing the progress with me, just because they don't know that they're neurodivergent, or the client or patient themselves might not know that they're neurodivergent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the other thing. Like, not everybody knows that they're neurodivergent.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in how therapists measure progress in therapy, because for us, we're very collaborative. So it's about how you feel the therapy is working for you, and we will periodically review that with you and see what is working and what is not working, and we will monitor that together. So it's a very collaborative relationship. I think that is can be quite different when you've got very behavioural type therapies as well. So that might be where the difference of experience comes. So we are relational at heart and person-centered. We may use some behavioural methods and tools if that works for the client and it's been adapted to be specifically for the client, for neurodiversity. But that's not what we lead with.
Yeah. But we've spoken about the things that don't work in traditional therapy. Let's speak about the things that do work and some of the methods that you guys use. Because what I alluded to was that the lady who diagnosed me used, and it was so natural, Kyra. It was like, okay, let's talk about executive functioning. I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
How did you know that I needed that without me advocating for the fact that I needed it?
Yeah.
And it was something exactly like, I'm sure your therapists approach it as just like, that's what we do. We're not accommodating. It's our nature. We help people like you. And I found those sessions that I had so extremely helpful because they were practical. They helped me. There were tips for my day-to-day life. And I still use some of those things. So what, in your opinion, makes therapy neurodivergent affirming?
A non-pathologizing approach is the number one thing I think that therapy needs to have in order to be neurodivergent affirming. So not looking at neurodiversity as a deficit, but as someone has a constellation of strengths and challenges within that. So that would be the first thing that I would say. And then everything kind of comes from that aspect. So going from a strengths-based kind of perspective, where are things working? Where does my client feel competent, and where can we build on that? And then looking at struggles and uncoupling this idea of poor mental health being part of neurodiversity. It's not. So seeing the impact of the system on the person is really neurodivergent affirming as well, because that's an anti-oppressive stance, and also understanding how relationship trauma can impact, and where that comes from, where that could come from, common experiences in schools, etc., is also part of that neurodivergent affirming approach. But understanding that sometimes the way that our neurodivergent profile can show up in certain behaviours and stuff can also be very similar to how trauma can show up as well. And kind of collaborating with the client to sort of say, well, which is which? Let's have a look. Let's explore that further. And then there's like really practical stuff, right? Like, I tend not to open my therapy sessions with, what's going on for you today? How are you this week?
I'll have a meltdown if I get asked that. Because I'm of the person, Kyra, if you ask me, how are you? I'm telling you the whole thing, because I don't really understand how far do you want me to go with that, or am I not tell you anything because I feel rejection towards that question. So it's a loaded gun, that question.
And it's something that we're taught to do as therapists. It's like a really natural thing, but it took me quite a while to unlearn that as well, because that's not a question that I struggle with, but I know a lot of my clients, and I love them for this. They've been like, can you not ask me that question, please?
I just got like the chills hearing that. I'm like, ugh, please don't ask me.
And I mean, a lot of the ways that we trained, we were told to, we're trained to operate in a very non-directive way. That's not always very helpful. For a lot of neurodivergent people, that is not helpful. Silences can be experienced differently. Exploring things somatically can be very difficult for some of us. And that can be down to trauma as well as a neurodivergent kind of experience. So just being aware of that and adapting our approaches and kind of seeing how the client feels about those things before we ask them to go and do that is like a very practical, just one of the tiny practical ways that we might approach adapting neurotypical style therapies for us and our neurodivergent clients.
And how do you and the therapist evolve your practice, in the sense that I can imagine that there's no specific therapy out there that you go and like CBT that says this is for neurodivergent people, right? So I'm sure it's a challenge to keep up to speed. Is that through shared experiences or shared stories with other patients or clients? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's several ways that we stay in contact with what people are saying they want and need. I mean, Jan and I and maybe one other on our team, we're the assessors, and our assessment is very collaborative. So we'll be talking with clients and listening and to what they want in a therapist and what they need and what therapies have and have not worked for them so far, and looking at, well, what was your experience of that? You know, like what you just told me about CBT, very common, very, very common. And from that, we've sometimes thought, so say, for instance, when we're working with ACT, a lot of people have said that works for them, particularly with ADHD. So we're like, that's interesting. Let's investigate that more. So there's that part of it. But then there's also like looking at the evidence base around things like drama therapy and creative therapies being particularly helpful. So we do offer those. Some of us don't, because it's not for everybody. And some of us do. So because we have that diversity on the team, we're able to learn from each other and borrow techniques and try things out.
Tell me more about that. What is it?
It's about being able to maybe work with story or work with narrative. Or we did a really interesting CPD session the other day where we were looking at working with a text online role-playing game that we can play with the client, and then they can explore different aspects of their lives and who they would like to be or who they feel they are and different parts of them, and begin to kind of get to know yourself better through all of those ways. And then, some of us work with music and some of us will work with body work and mindfulness and breathing techniques. And some of us will work with drawing, because sometimes when words are hard to either process in the moment, you don't have the words for your emotions.
So true. And I was actually speaking with James Hunt, who shares the stories of his son that they've recently found that he really enjoys to communicate through text. And it's if they've opened this new kind of way of communicating and getting further in conversations with his son. And I relate to that deeply, because when I'm, as an example, in shutdown, a phone call or verbal communication, I find it extremely difficult. I don't want to, and I only do it to cater for the people that need to hear. And it shouldn't be that way, right? So I find a lot of power in text if I don't feel like picking up the phone. So I can relate to that. It's other methods of communication that doesn't need words that many of us find difficult sometimes.
I mean sometimes I know this is my experience, and I imagine a lot of people also have this, but if I'm sensorily overwhelmed, or I'm in a situation where there's a lot of people and I'm having to talk, do these deep conversations, my words could just disappear completely.
Oh no, I'm listening more at the table beside me, at the table at the end of the restaurant, versus what you're trying to communicate. It's as if whatever you're saying goes over my head, and the volume gets toned up of everything else. So I relate to that. I become instantly nonverbal, and that's a big sign for the people around me as to like, it's too noisy here. Let's head out, or do you have a different table in the restaurant where we can be more comfortable?
So I mean that the arts can really help with that stuff, because words have their limits anyway. There's only so much you can express in words. I think traditional therapies do rely almost. There's an argument to say that too heavily on the verbal and on the cognitive, but there's so much wisdom that a metaphor can hold, or a picture can hold, and those kinds of communications.
Okay, so what's the majority of your clients look like right now? Because I know there's been a massive increase in diagnosis, myself included. I'm part of those numbers. Is it kind of early on diagnosed children? Do you see women coming through, or men that have been diagnosed later on in life?
It's very, very wide, actually. So I'd say 99.9% of our clients are neurodivergent. And we, some of our therapists will work with children from 3 upwards, if they can engage online. And we've got ways to kind of help children to do that. And we see young people as well, and adults. And many of our clients have often said that they've had bad experiences being turned away from the NHS and other services. And we haven't really kind of investigated that too much yet. But a lot of those clients will find a place with us. And we're in the process. We've just actually taken on a head of impact outcomes and evaluations. So we've just reached the point where we can take a breather and go, right, we're trying to bring this value to the community, and we have had good feedback that that's what we're doing, but we really want to check. So, and we want to know more about, like you say, where the majority of our clients are coming from, et cetera, a little bit more about it, because I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's, that's testament ultimately to the growth of diagnosis. And you see people accessing it early on in that diagnosis, pre-diagnosis. A lot of people, as we said, are self-diagnosed and don't ever really want those answers. So I think it's all valid within itself. I just think it's down to different experiences, really, right? Because I myself had a very challenging kind of, how do I put it, healing process, in the sense of coming to terms with the fact that I was autistic, when I thought I was going to receive it with open arms because I wanted answers. And I actually spent, Kyra, at least over a year not reading anything about autism, not touching any books about autism. I felt rejection towards it because I couldn't put into words my experience. I didn't want to read books or learn about it and then use other people's experiences as my own. I wanted to figure out how I felt about being autistic, so then I could go out and educate myself about others. So the likes of me, I would access neurodivergent-affirming therapy now, 3 years into the journey, versus early on. But I'm sure you see across the board many different.
We do. And I know a lot of people, they come to our service because they have recently been diagnosed and would like to have a really safe space to kind of explore what that means for them and their own identity. And I think that therapy can be really helpful, or at least the therapeutic spaces that we have developed can seem to be really helpful for people to be able to do that. To just have that space to kind of be open and honest about how they're feeling about that and how it impacts them, and also do a lot of grieving, because
that word is not used enough, and it's only used in a negative context, where you can grieve so many things, right? Like, you can grieve being diagnosed, because I grieved in the regression stage, post-diagnosis. I grieved my old ability. I grieved the ability Lara had when she was masking and pushing through these situations and doing meetings and doing this with no struggle, when in reality I was really challenged, but I wasn't really aware of that. And then when regression kicked in, I was kind of in that grieving process, not really believing that I would ever be able to do that again, right? So I'm sure there's different ways of grieving when you get diagnosed.
Yeah, and also when your child gets diagnosed, because I mean, even if you're the most like, just supportive and neurodivergent affirming parent in the world, like there are certain expectations and things that you might feel that you need to let go of, or even like the ease at which you expected to be able to deal with the school system, for example. You might not have any, be able to articulate this stuff, but to grieve that when a diagnosis comes in. And then I know also, there is intergenerational trauma often. So children's parents may have had really difficult experiences at school, and when they receive a diagnosis, they look back at their school years and think, if only someone had known or had picked this up, what would I not have had to go through? And those things as well.
I think if I'm brutally honest, I'm treating this as a therapy session, by the way. When I think of the likes of motherhood, right? Obviously, I'm pre-diagnosed, and I'll enter that stage if I'm lucky enough to have kids in the future. But I'll enter that stage knowing I'm autistic and aware of that. But I carry a lot of, I don't know if it's trauma or whatever. I carry a lot of anxiety around school because I got bullied. I really struggled. I went to 7 different schools, and I've always struggled with the idea of hanging around a school or having a coffee in front of a school because of the noise brings me instantly back to those years. So I already know, if I have kids in the future, that will be a very difficult stage for me, because I just imagine if my kids are going into school, they're going to be bullied the same way that I did, right? So is that kind of something that you guys also work on with parents?
Absolutely. I mean, and that really resonates with me and my personal experience and me and my boys' experiences, because, I came out, I was raging at schools. I did not want to talk to another teacher. I don't want to, absolutely raging, and also thinking it impacted whether to have another child or not, because I thought, I'm not putting them through that again.
Yeah, it's just difficult.
And so I can absolutely see that will come up a lot in therapy sessions for people. Definitely.
So speaking about Neuro Tribe, something that I'm hearing is that the therapists are extremely adaptive to whatever the client or patient needs, right? And something that I have experienced within the therapy world is that you find a therapist that claims or has the label of specializing in CBT, and that therefore that's the route that they go down. And I think that's also a big challenge, because if I arrive, to have a session with you, just because you're specialized in CBT, that means that in a biased way or not, you're going to force me down that route, right? So what type of therapies, we've briefly touched on it, but if I arrive to Neuro Tribe, what does that journey look like? What type of therapies or coaching do I have available?
Okay, so you'll come in and you'll speak to our assessment team, and we will speak to you for about half an hour, and we will go through a series of questions, and we will also ask you what it is you're looking for in a therapist and how life might look different for you if therapy was successful in your view. And we will then match you from listening to you and asking around social identities also and things like that. We will have a few people on our team in mind, because we know our team really well. We're like, this person's special interest, for example, is role-playing games, and they love drama, but CBT did not work for them so far, and they had a bad experience with the last therapist that they were with. They don't feel comfortable talking to someone who identifies as a man, so I've got 3 people in mind that might feel really good. Then you would, if you're happy to, you'd be matched with that therapist. You'll meet them for your first session, and it's a chance to get to know them, and they will collaborate with you on, okay, so I do drama therapy, for example. That doesn't sound like your thing. So we can just go for relational talking therapy. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I also do EMDR. So if at any point you think that might be useful for you, let me know and we can renegotiate the therapy relationship so we can do a bit of EMDR around this particular area of your life.
What is EMDR, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, gosh. It uses eye movements and directing your eye movements whilst focusing on a particular area of your life that you would like to kind of reprogram how you emotionally regulate around that experience.
Okay. So we could use then, say, Lara at school as an experience to then focus on and dive into the emotional feelings that I'm experiencing around that.
Yeah, and to explore it and to create to kind of resolve it and create maybe a feeling of a little bit of distance from it so that it's not impacting you so much somatically that it's difficult to even talk about, for example. And then you might be able to regulate enough when talking around that thing to explore it in therapy a little bit more, in more sort of relational therapy.
That's really interesting because I feel like you're kind of forcing yourself into visiting those emotions without being in the situation or in the location, which can be quite healing, right? Because I think it's very overwhelming if, I can give you an example, right? My school years were mainly in Spain, in my mom's hometown, and I fled as soon as I finished school. I left the country and I went to Switzerland to university and I never wanted to look back. And every single time I had to go back because it wasn't by choice. I have one friend from my hometown. And she speaks English and she can come visit, so I don't need to go. But every time I had to go back, or the thought of Christmas there was really triggering for me, and I really didn't enjoy the thought of being there. And as you know, those feelings were real. I had rejection. I didn't want to go there. And I was only confronted with those feelings when it was time to go. And it was like exacerbated completely. So I can imagine that type of therapy can be really useful because I'm sure other people have those experiences that are neurotypical. But if you're neurodivergent, we carry emotion differently and we're very sensitive to those type of things. So I felt it deeply in me that I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be in that space. So I can imagine that type of therapy is really useful.
That's what I have heard, and that's why we encouraged the therapists that do specialise in that on our team. Like, we're really fascinated by it, and it's not my area of therapy, like I say, but I'm pretty sure someone would be happy to come on and talk to you about that as well.
For sure, we can arrange that.
Clients have really said it's very useful in that aspect. I am aware that in terms of therapy around trauma, it's really important to go gently and slowly. And I know there can, sometimes people come with amounts of trauma and an urgency to kind of explore that. But like you say, we can hold our emotions around those kinds of things very viscerally, and they can be quite very dysregulating and overwhelming. So it's really important to pace the therapy, and that's something that we really are really aware of. As well.
Absolutely. Something that I see come up a lot about ADHD is medication, right? And I think there's mixed opinions. There's hesitation from people that have ADHD to kind of navigate that. How do you guys internally approach that? And what are your kind of thoughts of where does medication belong for someone that's ADHD?
Do you know, I think it's different for everybody with ADHD. I think, we are not in a position to be able to recommend or, not recommend. But what we say is, if that's something that you want to try, how we can support you is by if you let us know, and we will ask you about dosages and things like that, and we can help you to monitor and explore ways that it might be impacting mood, life, so that together we can kind of see, is it helpful to you or is it not? Or we're, very open to kind of exploring, well, what are the pros and cons for you and how might that impact your identity? And, there can be things that playing into that, like a distrust of medical professions. It can often be a thing, so you might want to explore all of that, but we would never say, you should or you shouldn't.
Oh,
Take
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the same way as being neurodivergent, medication shows up differently for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I've also had conversations about how hormones impacts that and how the female cycle impacts mood and rage, which I'm sure many women have felt on medication. But that's actually something that I kind of processed a bit when I got diagnosed, the fact that, not in a salty way, shall we say, but the fact that ADHD did have a little bit of a tool to make it easier, or that was my perception. And then autism, I was like, it's a shame there's nothing to medicate it, but maybe that was my approach coming from a lack of understanding and lack of awareness about I still needed to learn so much about my autism and not really see it as such a disability and more like, how can I live life in a better way and how can I create a space for me with different accommodations that my life can be easier, that isn't, say, medication, right?
Yeah, and I suppose but maybe that's one of the stages as well, because I mean, if you are grieving, there's several stages that we're going through. So there's several emotions that are totally valid, anger being one of them, all of those things that you've said sound perfectly valid to me at some point.
There's also validation, right? Which I think it's also, there's space for it. Like, of course, you go through that grieving process that we said, but I can say for myself, I'm kind of highlighting the negatives of that journey. I felt very validated for all my years, as we say, in school and through life, and making friends and lack of friends and feeling left out and socializing and all these things, that I felt like the one left out, when in reality there was a reason for that. So it is extremely validating for so many people later on in life.
And I've heard a lot of people reflect that back to us as well, about that's what the diagnosis can do. And I think especially when received early, I wonder if it makes a huge impact on not internalizing negative messages or taking responsibility in that way, personal responsibility for all of these things that are happening in your life that you're having to experience. I hope that's the case, because that's why we kind of pursued the diagnosis for our son. But it's really interesting to hear you say that. Yeah, I guess that's what, that's one of the things that we kind of hope that we're bringing by being a neurodivergent led organization, which is that validation, which is such an important thing.
It's so important, and it brings me back to what we were saying, is obviously that therapist to patient relationship, there's so much you can disclose, but by just knowing that person relates to your experience is so powerful, and it makes such a safer space that is not common in traditional therapy. So I think that's the beauty of what you guys are doing, and the fact that you share experiences amongst each other to continue growing your learning and to develop that. I think it's great. And I think also something that's true is that, as we know, being neurodivergent is a very personal experience and it relates to that individual, but there's no denying that being diagnosed autistic or ADHD or whatever that might be, it has a ripple effect into everything in your life, and it bleeds into your partner's life, into your parents' life, siblings, even friendships. So do you feel that in the journey when you're, working with neurodivergent people? Do you see it having an impact in the circle around them? And do you help the family as well?
It depends on what the client is bringing, really, because sometimes, that space is not to talk about. They don't have to talk about how it's impacting their family, their partner, their kids. Sometimes people just need a space to think about themselves, and that's absolutely so valid. We're just never mind, talk about you. But I think in terms of thinking about the impact in a family, for example, with a child, I mean, hopefully we have some things that are useful, because not only therapy, but we also have a parent coach and a neurodiversity coach. So
amazing.
Yasoda Rajadurai, she's our coach, and she helps with the practical things that you were talking about there, like some executive function, working with those things, but also sometimes just sitting with parents and thinking, how does this impact us, and how do we want to approach it? That's where we can kind of help and give that space to be able to explore those ripples and things if the client wants to.
It's obviously personal choice, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure, like, there's many families that can relate to my family's experience. We didn't know about autism, and I was 27, right? Like, my parents, they carried a lot of guilt themselves. And my sister as well, I know, because she's told me that they carry that guilt. That hurts me. It's like, it's the last thing I want them to carry. And I know for a fact that when I got diagnosed, they would have loved to have some form of person to guide them in that educational journey that they're embarking with me, to support me as well in how can they best communicate with me, how can they accommodate Lara if she's having a shutdown, which they would have never known what a shutdown is and how that shows up for me. So I think, you know, in a world in which we're going against the grain from traditional therapy, it's also great what you guys are doing of exploring, not only supporting the individual, but also the family and whoever needs that help to support the individual.
Yeah. And I suppose that's the area that our coaching often tackles. Our coach will tackle that bit. And we do have people, you know, we have supportive partners and things kind of calling up going, okay, well, I'm neurotypical and my partner is neurodivergent. And I mean, or sometimes we have people going, I'm neurotypical, I'm neurodivergent, and my partner is also neurodivergent, but we're completely different. And I don't know how to support them, and they don't know how to support me and help. And we're like, okay, cool. That's brilliant for going to coaching for. Because then you can both together have that conversation.
And it's a whole dynamic change because, like, you know, I have this theory that is not proved on any research, but the fact that neurodivergent people identify and recognize each other and have this unwritten communication that we just get it. But that doesn't mean that it comes easy, because someone that's ADHD has a whole different way of functioning than someone that's autistic. And it's like oil and water. How do you even cohabitate when someone wakes up and is ready to take on the world and I have a 17-step routine to not have a meltdown? So it's real.
And it is real. And you know, sometimes two people can have ADHD shows up completely differently for each person. And also gender norms and gender expectations do come into that as well. And I'm thinking of my own relationship here. But, you know, a woman with ADHD and the expectations and the extra mental load and the emotional load that she is expected to carry. And if she is with a man and the emotional load he is not expected to carry, and the way that can impact ADHD on both sides is a real thing, and it can cause real conflict. So there's lots of things that come into that.
It can cause conflict because as well, it's like, I can speak for myself, communicating your needs is difficult for me, and I would only communicate them when I'm kind of at a breaking point. So the challenge is there in relationships, where can the other person, as you mentioned, take the load, but also be able to identify that person needs help. And so many people go through that tango, that dance of like, where do we find balance, and how can I support you without sacrificing things that I also need? And an example, Kyra, I can give it very clear. I have a very busy week, and I'm not diagnosed ADHD, by the way. I'm autism, but whenever there's other things going on in my life, like work or meetings, or I'm recording an episode like today, which I'm so excited about, all the other things that I usually do go out the window, like dishes. My room is a bomb site currently because I'm just stepping over it because that's a tomorrow issue, you know? And my partner very kindly over the past few days, quietly, steps in and picks up the load. We've very balanced life, but he identifies that, like, I can't even really cook, so he'll step in and cook for me without communicating. And I think I'm very privileged to have that in my life, but that didn't come from day one. We had to communicate. I had to say, I currently can't speak. I'm going through a shutdown, you know? So whilst it's difficult to navigate and find that new reality in relationships, it does have the beautiful bright side if you're able to reach that point together and work together, right? Which is ultimately what a relationship is about.
Yeah. And I think it's often the same for parent and child as well. And I think, you know, especially where people in relationship are at different stages of their journey of identifying with neurodiversity as well. And also, I noticed that there can sometimes be a thing where if you were neurodivergent and that was not well received or wasn't known about back then, so a kind of generational thing, you know, and it was really difficult and there was some quite harsh treatment that came with that. You know, we can be tempted as parents to kind of, if we have children who are going through identifying with neurodiversity, we can sort of go, well, you know, that harsh treatment didn't do me any harm, so you just have to get on with it. You just have to get on with it and get up and go to school, and then we can have guilt around that as well. So there's all sorts of mixed up things going on there.
There's a lot, and I think at the end of the day is like, parents and everyone, it's kind of our first gig here, right? We're all learning together. And I think this neurodivergent increase of diagnosis is like everyone's learning. And I don't, you know, reprimand anyone for not knowing or not having the understanding because I didn't have it when I got diagnosed, you know, and I would have loved to and I should have, but I didn't have anyone in my environment that was. And therefore, like, there was no real need for me to know about it. And I think as long as people are growing with the growth of diagnosis and they're learning and as long as you approach it from a place of curiosity and wanting to learn, I don't know any other community more than the neurodivergent community that wants to share, that wants to have those conversations and educate people in a lovely way. Like, no one will take it from a judgmental standpoint that you don't know, because we're so used to being undermined and kind of put aside because it's an invisible disability that we're just used to people not knowing. But if people are curious and wanting to learn, I feel like we're extremely eager to do that. And that's at least what I've found with the people that come on to speak, because everyone's keen to share their story and to share their experiences to educate people, really.
And I think that that's the lovely progression that I see now, you know, compared to like 15 years ago when we set up, when there wasn't really any language around to even have these conversations about it in any way that wasn't negatively framed. And now I see such a huge amount of, you know, places to go to have these conversations and be curious about it and stuff. I think that's, it's a lovely thing.
Okay, so what's the future for Neuro Tribe? I know you said there's... You're like, I don't know what we're doing this afternoon. Please don't ask me about the future.
Forward planning. I think, well, we've got some really good training programs that we're working on to kind of help companies and schools and workplaces become more neuro-inclusive. So we have trauma-informed training going on, which we're in partnership with Facilitation 101.
Amazing.
So they're another really amazing organisation, and we've been doing that. So we're hoping to bring that to a wider audience. And we do anti-oppressive training as well, which is very experiential and kind of creative training. And we're really looking forward to growing the coaching practice to offer those more practical aspects and more practical tools and helpful things, and have those conversations like the ones you were talking about, you know. Just
count
onwards
me
and
in.
upwards.
Count me in, because I think even though we're all navigating neurodiversity in a different way and at a different pace, I think we all can benefit from the practicality aspect of it. Our daily lives are challenged, right? So what are the little things that we can increase and include to just live better and know ourselves a little bit better? I think that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, we're just loving the work that we do, basically.
Yeah, I think it's so special what you guys are doing, because as I've said, I haven't seen anything like it. And as a community that feels kind of not really represented or seen in standard media or standard therapy or just neurotypical world, really. I think to have that corner where you instantly enter and you're understood for how you're wired and your brain and your difference, I think is beautiful, because as you said, like, it's not accommodating, it's just we are. And that's the way we practice, and that's the type of therapy we do. And there's no stigma around it. It's just you're supporting neurodivergent people that need that little bit of help, right?
Yeah, exactly. And thank you for giving us the opportunity, because I know we're not great at pushing our name out there and helping people to know that we're here. So it's been really lovely to have the opportunity.
No, and I feel like for me, it's just the fact that you guys exist. I know myself, I'll access those services, and I know that so many other people will as well, because there's nothing like it out there. And I think you guys are doing amazing work. So, okay, we're coming to the end.
Okay.
And there's something that we do with every guest that comes into Spicy Brain Podcast, and that is a fire round questions.
Oh, gosh.
So I have 3 questions for you, if you're ready. So first one, ADHD or autism, what is most misunderstood in therapy?
Oh my goodness. It's a loaded one. What day it is. It depends on who you're talking to. Perhaps. I can't answer that. ADHD is my instinct to say.
That's perfect.
It's not based on any kind of evidence.
Do you know what it's based on, Kyra? Lived experience. Therapist experience. And that's more than the experience I have.
Ask me tomorrow, it'll be a different answer, but okay.
Well, that's it. Perfect. ADHD in that case today. The second question is, what would be one word to describe how therapy should feel for neurodivergent people?
Validating. Yes, I'm sure about that one. Validating.
That was, you didn't hesitate.
No.
There's no changing that. That is for sure. And I agree with that one. Okay. Third question and last one. One thing neurodivergent people bring as a strength.
Oh, just one thing.
So many things. So many things. But you know why I asked that question? Because we always speak about the challenges that neurodivergence brings. And being autistic or ADHD, we're obviously challenged on a day-to-day basis. But no one really speaks about, and this is not a superpower type of conversation, because I have a lot of thoughts about that. And I have strong thoughts that won't fit into the fire round question. But I do think that there's strengths that we have. And everyone likes a different strength. Right? So I love my loyalty about my autism. I'm fiercely loyal to my people. If you ask someone else, it might be their resilience. So based on the people that you have in treatment, what would be one thing that you're like, that is excellent about them?
A complete intolerance of injustice.
Couldn't agree more. I'm on that boat as well. I will go to hell and back for my morals. I'll burn bridges. I don't care if we've been friends for 15 years. If you stand for something that is unjust and immoral in my mindset, we're done. And I think so many autistic and neurodivergent people are like that. And it's amazing.
It is. And also, I just think it's the root of so many like services like Neuro Tribe, where you're like, I'm not having that. That's not happening. That drive to create the fairness that you want to see in the world. I love that.
And I love that. And it's usually labeled as inflexible, which I've probably been called inflexible so many times as my middle name right now. And I don't care. I'll continue to be inflexible as long as I stay true to my morals, to what I consider fair and just in the world. And I think as well, we're currently living in a very scary time. And there's so many injustices going on that I think I'm proud of the autistic community, because a lot of people that I follow and that I see online, they stand for true justice as a majority, right? So I think I agree with you. That's an excellent one. So thank you for sharing that.
There's only one. There's like a million, but
there's 100,000. That's fine. But that's a very strong one. Okay, I promise this is not a fire round question, but just a final question as we wrap up. There are a lot of late diagnosed autistic people that I'm sure you see in therapy, and we have spoken about kind of the impact of what diagnosis looks like when it's early on in life and then later on. And it comes with a lot of added trauma and different challenges on both ends, right? But there are a lot of late diagnosed autistic listeners today. And so to say, if they're starting that journey with autism, what would be something you recommend to them? To what should they do next once they hear that you are autistic?
Find a space to explore how that impacts you, and how and to build a way of thinking about it that serves you well, and find a space to be able to do that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. That's brilliant advice. Kyra, thank you for sitting down with me.
It's been amazing. Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
I actually and truly admire you, I must say, because in a world that I've explored therapy and I've found it really challenging, I think what you're doing is going against the grain. You're breaking rules. You're disrupting the giggle. You're so proud of that. And I love that. And I love to see it, that you're taking up space and you're disrupting the space and you're making change, because what we're so used to as neurodivergent people is that we're forced down a system. And what you're doing is saying no to the hell no with that. And you're creating a system that works for us, that empowers us and doesn't make us question who we are and why we're different. And it's extremely validating. So for that, thank you, because it's very powerful what you do.
Thank you very much.
And to those who are listening, if you are on the same boat that I was about therapy isn't for me, maybe, I hope this conversation changes your mind, because it definitely has changed my perception of what therapy is. And in the meantime, check Neuro Tribe out, but we'll also catch you on the next episode.